Have you ever noticed how many voices you have in your head? Me too. There's ones that tell us what we should do, there's the ones that shame us for what we've done, and we're going to talk about those voices, and also we're going to talk about the villain inside of me. So you can join me on Instagram. I love our Instagram community, and it's on Instagram with Live Brighter with Tara. Or you can come to my website at livebrighter.info, and I love hearing from you guys. And I love you sharing your thoughts and feelings about all of this. The fact that we have so many thoughts in a day is incredible. Supposedly, we have about 70,000 thoughts in our head a day, and 95% of those are repetitive. And when we start to capture our thoughts and capture our voices that we're hearing, it's very interesting because we can see that there's patterns, and there's almost like voices in our head that have distinct voices and things that they do in different parts. And so we're going to talk about this combination of part therapy and also attachment theory. Is if the people that want to study this more, they can look in those areas, and we're going to apply it to ourselves. So as far as the voices in our head, I'm going to talk about like 5 different areas or places that these voices come from. The first voices are our story starters. So story starters are at some point in our lives, in our development, and many times as kids, we come up with a story that adopts a belief. And then that belief just gets reiterated, and it becomes kind of a persona, a part. A trauma, and it doesn't have to be just trauma, because you can get these from trauma and our interpretation of the traumatic event, but it doesn't even have to be traumatic where our minds will come up with a belief or a part of us that now has adopted this idea or this principle and then just reiterates, and then we've got that part of us. So that's very interesting, our story starters. Many of our story starters can sound something like this, like I only speak up. When I speak up, I cause conflict. Another one is my needs are not important. And it's interesting because I do hypnotherapy to address the parts in us that have come up with these ideas that don't no longer serve us. But they came up for a reason, and they were important at the time, and they served a purpose. And usually it was like to protect us, to help us pivot, all sorts of things. But it's usually protecting us. And so it's very interesting when we go and address where these parts came from. Other parts could come up with idea, I'm not enough, I need to stay small and not share my desires to be accepted, I'm not safe, I need to say sorry all the time and stay small. So a lot of them are about keeping us small and keeping us limited. And they come from our stories and a part that kind of detaches and has its own persona, which is super interesting. For example, I like the example by Garrett Gunderson, and he's a financial guy that writes plenty of books. I recently read one of his books called Killing Sacred Cows, which is a financial book, and it was very interesting. But I don't know which one of his works he talked about it, but he was actually hit by a car when he was 3 years old. And so he had to be driven in a car to the hospital. And so he's been hit by a car, and he's laying down in the back seat, and his mom is crying, and it's just like this this big intensity thing. And at that moment at 3, he decided, his brain decided to believe that my pain causes pain to others. And so for many years he was shut down because he had this subconscious part or this subconscious belief about that. And so he was just living in accordance to that. And so that's an example of how these parts can take hold, or these beliefs take hold at incidences and get perpetuated in our lives when we're not aware of it. So that's when it's basically our story starters. Happy holidays. I wanted to make your season a little brighter and lighter. And so I'm offering 2 things for free. One is a relaxing meditation, and the other one is the BARF notebook. And that is a system for working through our feelings and our thoughts by barfing them out, sorting them out, and planning them out. Those are both for free on the website at livebrighter.info. So go ahead and go there and pick up your free gift to help support you this holiday season, and live brighter every day. Make it a great day. The second one is our ages of development. Many times we have parts in us that are congruent with the ages of our development. Like the 2-year-old in us, the tantrum thrower that wants their way, the sassy teenager, the know-it-all 20-year-old. And the interesting with each of those parts is they usually have a fear underneath them. Like the 2-year-old is afraid it's not going to get what it wants. And the sassy teenager wants to be heard. And the know-it-all 20-year-old wants to be right because it wants to be good and perfect in its eyes. And so it's very interesting that as we question these little parts and give them a voice and talk to them, we learn that they're kind of expressions of our fears and have the flip side, and it's important to just be aware of them. Another one is the replicas, I call. And the replicas are basically people we have looked up to or have hurt us in our lives, like a mother wound or a father wound or something like that. And they're the strong voice in our minds, and they're the ones that are really shooting us and shaming us. So those are the replica voices. Like, I've got the voice of my mom and she's always with me even though she's passed away, sort of situation. But it's important to identify. It's like, oh wow, that voice actually sounds like my mom, or that voice sounds like, this authority figure. So it's very interesting to see that some of our parts, or some of them, are replicas, is what I would call them. And then another one, the fourth one, I would say is the villain, the victim, and the savior. And that's very interesting because I think we all could potentially have a villain, a victim, and a savior with them, which all are part of a victim consciousness, as far as they all lead to lack of ownership of our own stuff. So, but what's interesting on this one is I really saw this part show up. I'd mentioned I don't know how many podcasts ago how I get these nightmares, and they're very it's the same feeling and the kind of the same scenario, as far as we've got the victim, we've got the villain, and then I'm usually the protector, but they're disturbing dreams. And I'm I've been wondering for a while, why am I having these regularly disturbing dreams where, they're all in different places, whether it's a flood or whether it's war, but there's always the villain, the victim, and the savior. And I'll get more into those parts with me and what those parts meant in just a little bit. But yes, I have the victim, the villain, and the savior, and just understanding each of those parts and where they came from. So it'll make more sense when I explain my story. We also have a kind of a God, devil, angel part of us too. And it's very important to make sure that we're assigning God his really God part. Because I think many of us, when we think that we have a part like the angel or the God voice, that many times it's a shaming voice or a don't do that sort of thing. And I would say that would be more the devil voice. Because the devil is the condemner. It says he's the condemner of the brother. And he's the shamer, because shame keeps us at a distance from God. So anything that causes condemnation and shaming is probably the devil voice. Whereas God, he's always wanting to get closer to us, God and the universe, and love us. And he sees things that could potentially hurt us. He's like, oh, that's not gonna help you. I love you. Let's talk about that. And it's usually a still, quiet voice. It's not that loud, don't do that, da 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 da. If you do that, you're da da da. That's definitely, I would say, not the God voice, because God is more like a father that delights in his children, and we all trip and fall in the mud at points, and he's more than happy to help us up. But it's a very loving voice. So I think it's interesting to know which one's which in that. So it's very interesting that we have the different parts of us. And how does this show up in our lives? Well, it actually affects how we look at the world. It affects how we show up in the world. And it affects how we have relationships and how we attach to others in relationships. And so it's super important. I don't know if you guys have learned anything about attachment styles. It's super interesting about attachment styles. But basically, we have the secure attachment, and we have the attachment that wants to, distance, and we have the attachment that wants to cling, and then we have the person that wants to do both. And they basically all really come out during conflict. How do we react during conflict? A healthy attachment means that we're giving and receiving in relationship. We're not over giving, or we're not being the one that's receiving all the time. There's this constant flow. We're independent, we take care of our needs, and we're interdependent at the same time, but we're not dependent on others to meet our needs. We are very good at knowing our needs, wants, and desires, and good at helping ourselves obtain those things. A secure attachment or secure person is authentic. That means that they can share their thoughts and feelings and desires, or the things that they're like, that doesn't work for me or that doesn't feel good. And they can do that comfortably. And they care about others' thoughts and feelings. They know their, again, they know how to advocate for their wants, needs, and desires. And so this is very interesting because I definitely would not say this described me as far as like authentic, sharing my thoughts and feelings comfortably, all of that. I very much cared about others' thoughts and feelings, but being able to share my thoughts and feelings or say, hey, that's actually not for me, or, actually I'm not aligned with that, or, let's negotiate because that actually isn't working for me. Oh my goodness. I definitely could not have said that like 8 years ago. So it's very interesting to see my evolving. And so back to the parts, like when our parts get stuck where they're acting out within us, then it can lead us to not being completely developed, not being able to completely attach, overreacting to things, or just reacting stronger. And we're like, whoa, where did that come from? Or things like that. And it basically limits us. It limits what we can do, where we can show up. So it's really great to be comfortable knowing the different parts of us, all the parts of us, and letting them all have rooms basically a seat at our table. And so back to my part about my nightmares. So what I learned about those nightmares is basically I had the victim, villain, and the savior at war within myself. And as I was looking into those parts and being like, well, where did these parts come from? I found out like my victim came from, being victimized and allowing it. And then I found that my savior part actually started when I was closer to like 5 years. No, I guess I was 7 years old. And at that point, my older brother was getting bullied by this bully. And the funny thing is I still remember his name. And I remember him trying to ride over my brother in his bike. And I'm the little sister, 15 months younger. And I'm like standing up and being like, no, Bobby, you cannot touch my brother, da 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 da. And so there was definitely this part in me, which is a beautiful part, but felt like it had to protect her brother. But unfortunately, that savior part, or that part that wants to stand up for others, also disempowers others in one sense. And so it's interesting to kind of see how, yes, that part was helpful, and it's good to know the shadow side of that part as well. But the villain is even more interesting. Like, oh my goodness, why do I have a villain in there that wants to like cause harm or this and that? And so just kind of being curious, because it always starts with like just being curious and loving. And really what happened is like the villain in me, or that part of me, was the one that had regular boundaries crossed and had to become the villain in order to protect itself. And now can kind of be a little bit more of a villain in my mind. And I didn't really like notice it in my mind as much as in my dreams. So it was very interesting. But when I came down to it, that villain that was causing me so much challenge, because I always related to the savior. Like I'm always protecting the person, and I'm always having to do that and not wanting to, and having, all this stuff. But really they were all three parts of me. And so really just giving a voice to the villain, who said, basically, you have self-abandoned so long, for all of those years, and you've never actually said sorry to me, and I've had to rise up in order to be there and kind of be the villain. And so that was really interesting to kind of be aware of all of those parts and allow that. So it's good to eavesdrop on our thoughts and our dreams, because then we start seeing patterns, and we start saying, oh my goodness, I see this part of me, or I see this part shows up at this time. And it's a great way for us to do our healing. And so the question I have is, when we get these beliefs or we see this part, we get to question it with curiosity. Like, what belief does this part have? What fear does it have? Am I allowing this part a seat at my table? Am I listening to it? Or am I just shoving it down, being like, oh my goodness, you're a villain. You cannot be the table because you're violent and I don't like it. So, which is probably what I was doing. What am I avoiding? Like anytime we're avoiding feelings or avoiding like the darker side of us, it does not help because it's still there. And so just exploring it and being curious helps. For example, I recently worked with a client that was having disappointment, the feeling of disappointment, and was kept resisting it with like food or trying to talk down to it. And, during our process, we really just explored the disappointment, the feeling of disappointment in our body, and asked the disappointment, like, what is it trying to tell us? Because remember, feelings are information. They're trying to tell us information. And so when we look at it and we see it and we allow it, and then we ask it questions, she found out the disappointment was really wanting her to be more confident in herself and that she could do that. And so a lot of times those feelings that we're rejecting and resisting really just need to be felt and listened to. So again, what feelings am I avoiding? What beliefs am I having and why do I believe this? And where did this story come from? Do I want to have this story or this belief? Is it serving me? What do I want to believe? But not at the expense of being like, oh, you cannot be here. You have some beliefs that I'm not okay with. Just allowing, like, okay, we've got our villain, we've got our angel, we've got the 2-year-old, we've got the 25-year-old victim, we've got all of them at the table, and we can be the CEO. And that's the best thing about being an adult, is because as children, especially up to the age of 7, we just take everything in. And we believe that everything is really our fault. So if our parents weren't available and we felt like we had to play small in order to manage their emotions, we believe that that was our fault rather than their inability to manage their emotions. And so it's super important to go back and look at things with that adult mindset and with the adult caring mindset. And so as adults, we can be the CEO of our table of advisors. And we've got some diversity in there, and diversity is good. And we just allow them all to express. And it's very interesting that we can actually learn some of the best things from our darker sides or the villain or the different parts of us. And that's really good just to be compassionate and understanding of all of it and comfort those parts. Because I find that, especially those parts that I adopted as a child, I can actually go back to the child, the timeline and be the adult now, the CEO now, go back to that child in that memory and give that child what it needed, and give it the information it needed, the comfort it needed, and give it what it needed. And it's amazing how that will soothe, as it gets that attention, soothe those parts. And so that's really the power of hypnotherapy, is because we do this in more of a meditative state or an alpha brainwave state. And so we can basically change that part, and it starts changing the whole landscape of our subconscious to align with what we want to do, what we want to believe, and, by working through those parts and soothing them and being appreciative of them rather than being like, oh no, you can't be here. Oh, that's bad. So that is what we're talking today, all the parts in our brain. So I really encourage us all to just take time to listen to ourselves. I have like a little space in my closet I call my Zen den, and I just take time every day to listen to the parts, or listen to my soul, listen to my body, what feelings are going on, and just be curious. And really just to allow those feelings and those parts. It's also good when we can start adding, parts to our table. Because, just say like, pretend like I'm the CEO, here's my table. And, there's been that critical part and this and that. And the more I just honor what the fear or what that critical part was saying, and then I also, allow the encourager to come on board, and the encourager and cheerleader is always telling me, good job, keep it up, all the little things, and just kind of creating a board that is more like serving us. And I think that's just super important. So we can add parts too. But I encourage us not necessarily to resist the negative parts, but be curious and see, what do they want? What are they feeling? Where do they need to be healed and loved? And where do they need to be heard? Because they have some really good information. So I want you to just take a deep breath in, a belly breath, and breathe out slowly. I want you to take a deep belly breath in and breathe out slowly. I want you to just go inside of yourself, and as I ask this question, just try to remember the first thing that comes to your head. What part of me wants a voice? I encourage you to write that down. And then, what feeling am I resisting? And write that down. And then that can be your Zen Den homework, where you can take some time and just explore that. And I'll be curious to see what you come up with and how it serves you. So make it a great day. I believe in you.